Welcome to Pod Have Mercy.
Well, I want to welcome everyone back to Pod Have Mercy. I know that you've been checking your feed relentlessly for the last couple of weeks, but we are back. This is season 100 and where are we now? We're a lot. We're many in. And John will join us next week, but this week I have the joy of being in conversation with Richard Beck. And at the Crossing, we're doing a series right now called The Gospel According to Johnny Cash. We've done The Gospel According to Ted Lasso and The Gospel According to U2. And so so we're doing this one is a Gospel According to Johnny Cash. And I started reading a book by that title, and I looked down and lo and behold, the author is from Abilene, Texas.
Of all places, if you've ever been. Yeah.
And so I called Richard Beck up and I said, we got a bunch of folks reading your book and loving it, and would you come and speak? And so he's here this weekend to speak at the Crossing. And this podcast will roll out after you've gone home, but we're just delighted that you're here.
No, excited to be here.
Yeah,
excited about the study you're doing.
You are obviously an author. You're a professor at Abilene Christian and psychology. You are deeply invested in theology and the way that kind of gets lived out. I don't know if that would be a theological anthropology, but like the way it gets lived in us, through us. I just find your Substack, which is experimental theology. How long have you been writing on
2007.
that?
It's been a long time. It's been a long time. Yeah.
It's this great. I think I tripped over that maybe around 2008 or 2009. So there's a group of folks here at the church that read that as a... Yeah,
there's readers been with me a long time, since the beginning. So, yeah.
It's really great. So thank you.
I appreciate
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just, as a way of getting into our conversation, would you tell us just a bit about your journey and, kind of what brings you?
Yeah, that could be a long one or a short one. But I grew up in Pennsylvania, was a member of Churches of Christ, but came south, met my wife when I was at Abilene Christian. I got my undergraduate degree in Christian ministry, pivoted. I was going to do work in church, but pivoted away to do psychology, got a master's degree, worked 4 years in a psychiatric hospital, got my doctorate degree, and wanted to teach and do research. I'm an experimental psychologist, so the research side is what I've leaned into. And the early part of my career was mental health related clinical research, but honestly, about 20 years ago, my interest in psychology of religion came back, kind of connecting with my graduate training with my undergraduate work, and started writing online. I found a lot of the thoughts I was coming up with didn't have a very easy place in either psychology, which is too theological, or too psychological for the theological sphere. And blogs were starting up back then, and a friend said, well, just put some of that stuff out online. And so I started doing that, and then from that, books came out. And so that's kind of where I've camped out over the last 2 decades, is that integration of spirituality, faith, theology with psychology.
That's great. What interests you? What brings you into that intersection? Because I think I think at least a lot of evangelical folks have kind of come out of that camp. It's really an either or, and so many times psychology is looked upon as a bit suspicious.
Yeah,
And so and you're at a Church of Christ university as well, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
It's associated with that.
Yeah.
I think most of our students are evangelical.
Yeah.
That's changed a lot with the demographics of our denomination, but I'd say most of my students are coming from non-denominational evangelical churches. I do think there's some suspicion. I think that's changing a lot. I think historically, the psychology would have maybe been described from evangelicals as like humanistic.
Yeah.
And by that I mean like a very optimistic view of the human person and agency.
Yes.
That we can, through our own effort, through our own devices, self-actualize, achieve mental health. And I think obviously faith traditions, especially evangelical traditions with like a lower anthropology, more pessimistic about human nature, are going to look at that whole project very suspiciously. Yeah. There's like no way on your own that you're going to be able to kind of achieve meaning or joy or any sort of psychological resiliency. But I do think that's changed, because I know a lot of evangelical pastors, friends of mine, who in the face of this mental health crisis we're dealing with are starting to bump up against their own levels of competency or expertise. And so they're quickly realizing, hey, I might need to reach out to my community or the mental health professionals sitting in my pews and let them have a word and give me some assistance. A lot of pastors are going back for mental health training,
Yes.
given the mental health issues they're dealing with. So I do think there's more openness on that side. And I also think from the psychological side, with what's called the positive psychology movement, which is almost 30 years old now, that psychologists who are trying to study happiness, joy, resiliency have realized that when you look at the happiest, most resilient, most grateful people in the world, they tend to have a spiritual commitment. And so you're seeing psychology move towards faith as just a coping resource. And so I do think it's a better conversation than it was maybe a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, one of the things that brings you to this chair today is that just your work on Johnny Cash. And I'd like to just enter into kind of some of that conversation of what led you to write that book and what interests you about Johnny Cash. How did you come up with the title of the book, which is just great? As well. Yeah,
that's a hard right turn. So we're talking faith, spirituality. Now we're talking about country music. How's a Christian psychologist end up writing about a country music star? It happened because of prison ministry. So a part of my journey was starting to work out as a chaplain. So north of my hometown in Abilene, there's a maximum security unit, and I'm a volunteer chaplain out there. And I wasn't a huge Cash fan. Like a lot of people, I knew Johnny Cash. It's hard not to know a little bit about Johnny Cash. Like a lot of people know things about Elvis. But I remember I was in a music store, and there was a discount CD bin. Remember CDs? And I saw, like, for $1, Johnny Cash live at Folsom Prison. And I thought, oh, that'd be great to just listen to back and forth to the unit. So I put it in. I would just listen to live at Folsom Prison back and forth out to the unit. And then right around that time, a really great biography came out about Cash, and I read it. And I just realized the gospel themes in his life, not just in his music, but in his own Christian confession and struggles to live up to his own faith ideals. That my publisher talked to me about what I'm thinking about, and I thought, I think I'd like to write a book about Johnny Cash and mix in some of my own memoir of working with incarcerated persons and what I was learning in that space as well. So I did a deep dive into Johnny Cash, and I was listening to all of his music very intensively. And so every time I drove my son back and forth to school in the morning and picked him up, we were just listening to Johnny Cash. And Aiden, my son, quipped one morning on the way to school. He says, Dad, Johnny Cash sings about 3 things: trains, Jesus, and murder. And I said, that would be a great title for a book. And it ended up becoming the title of the book, Trains, Jesus, and Murder.
I love that. That's fantastic. And one of the things that kind of has drawn us, at least, to Johnny Cash, as almost an icon or a way to look through into our faith, is that, and Philip McRae says this all the time, is that in so many ways, Johnny holds this tension that often gets overlooked in modern ways of looking at spirituality, but this tension of deep struggle and pain that it seems to be persistent. It's not this kind of idea that I gave my life to Jesus and it got better,
right, yeah.
But often I followed Jesus and it got a lot worse. But also this kind of impulse of grace and a desire to turn towards grace, even in the mid of his addiction, that was somehow almost like water in him. It moved fluidly. Yeah. It wasn't a fixed state, but those things existed together. Can you talk just a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's in his art. So his art has these jarring juxtapositions, which is kind of what that title is doing with Trains, Jesus, and Murder. What are those doing together? And so even if you just listen to a concert, like live at Folsom Prison, you're going to go through these murder ballads. But then he'll pivot in the very end of the concert and sing a song called Greystone Chapel about faith and spirituality. So his art embodied that.
Yeah.
His persona embodied that, because he would swing from kind of a bad boy image to, recording a whole gospel album. But then his what's most poignant is his personal life struggle with those ideals. And in many ways, it doesn't kind of fit into a neat kind of evangelical testimony. There was a season in his life when he first overcame his addiction. His wife, June Carter Cash, helped him recover. Right. And he writes a biography. Right around that time, he's also doing concerts and going around with Billy Graham. And he's kind of up there as a beaten this thing.
Yeah, but, the poster boy for change.
Exactly. But if you know his story subsequently, that he relapsed multiple times and he carried that struggle all the way to his grave.
Yeah.
And so I think his own personal struggle speaks very profoundly about all of our own failings, the regrets that we carry, and how there's that Lutheran claim that we're both simultaneously saints and sinners. There's something about his life that kind of embodies that sense that he was a saint, he was saved, he loved Jesus, but never was able to fully shake off the dark side of the struggles during his lifetime. And I think, especially when you work with incarcerated populations like I do, like that speaks profoundly to their lived experiences.
Yeah. And I also think what I loved about that is I think it speaks to people in suburbs that have not necessarily experienced incarceration, but don't know how. I think sometimes folks that are recovering addicts, folks that have experienced incarceration, there's some that the veneer has been pulled away.
Right. Yeah.
In the suburbs, I think it's the same experience, but there's a meta narrative that becomes totalizing often that's not helpful.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's something about Johnny Cash's story that we're discovering that holds those two things. Before we turned on the microphones, we were talking about his song "Hurt," that really at the end of his life, this great Trent Reznor song.
Yeah.
I guess Trent said at the end after he heard it, he's like, "That's not my song."
Yeah,
anymore.
right.
Right.
Yeah. He kind of lost the right to that song in many ways. Yeah. I mean, there's lines in that song. There's obviously Reznor wrote it in the midst of a heroin addiction, but what Cash sings it at the end of his life, there is a sense of looking back over that whole life of, successes, but a lot of struggles as well. And there's lines in there like "My Empire of Dirt."
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us can look back at our lives and realize I might have just invested great swaths of that in something that appears like success, like an empire, career-wise or whatever that attainment might be, but realize that I might have invested in some things that were temporary or that were vainglorious, and that only comes into view with years and wisdom and looking back on what our priorities maybe should have been. But I really do appreciate your point about the struggles of the suburbs and how we can make a lot of these discussions about very exotic or criminal activity, but we're all beating back to darkness in one form or another.
Yeah. There's a lot of criminal activity in the suburbs.
That's yeah.
You're gonna meet some of them tomorrow.
Yeah. That's probably true. It's everywhere.
That's great. Well, you're writing a book. You said that's coming out soon, the book that just came out in October.
Right.
Is one about joy. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So my latest book came out in October. It's called The Shape of Joy. And it's probably the most psychological forward book. Most of my books have been about faith and spirituality, but this one I really lead strong with psychology, open up with our mental health crisis, which I think everybody sees around us, and trying to get to the roots of that, and using the research of positive psychology, which I mentioned. So this is the science of happiness, the science of human flourishing, and what can it point us towards. Yeah. And so the two moves of the book are, the first part is how a lot of our mental health crisis, I argue, is stemmed from kind of an increasingly self-referential approach to mental health. Yeah. That we're kind of stuck in our heads, constantly trying to rehabilitate our own self-assessments, our own self-images. The way I describe it is we're trying to achieve mental health through self-regard. And that's effortful because, as anybody knows, life is going to give you a lot of negative feedback. We experience setbacks and failures, and so we're always trying to rehabilitate our self-talk. And that's, I think, wearying. The research on positive psychology is pointing us to things like gratitude, joy, meaning in life, awe, wonder, mattering, and all of those are pointing us outside of ourselves.
Yes.
That mental health isn't found by digging inside of ourselves and staying locked in our heads, but rather making contact with the reality that is bigger and other than my own, that pulls me out of myself into a relationship with the world.
Yes.
So I'm kind of using psychology to go from the mental health crisis to a conversation about transcendence or spirituality or faith as a way to kind of get the attention of a culture that is increasingly looking for some mental health answers.
That's great.
Yeah.
What does the role of community and relationship then have to do with that, what you're talking about?
Well, I think a lot of this is a discipline of memory. I think it's easy to lose the thread of your life, especially if you're excessively online, that we can kind of get lost in our heads and we get lost in work and the metrics and the feedback of work. And so faith communities are vital because they remind us of our story, coming back together and practicing worship, practicing gratitude, stepping into wonder and transcendence as we experience God and talk about God. So I think, to me, faith communities kind of, in many ways, carry the story for us when we lose the thread. Because if we don't have those moments where people are carrying me or reminding me of that bigger story, then we're left to our own devices and quickly get lost.
Yeah. There's so much isolation that's happening that people are experiencing within our culture now.
Yeah.
A deep sense of being alone, even surrounded by, in a city of 4 million people, just that deep sense of like, I'm alone, right? And I think that movement towards meaning always seems to be a movement towards the other.
Yeah.
And there's something about that, even like in the psychology and of the Spirit, where 2 or 3 are gathered, that sense that God's presence shows up in the midst of relationships, even in the creation story, that's.
And I think people also help us when we do get overly negative in our own like self-assessments. They're the people that do kind of stand before us as sacraments of God's love, where we might not be able to believe it. Our faith community, our friends, our family stand in front of us and say, "No, this is who you are, and I need to remind you of that." Right. And we all need that from time to time.
Yeah. No, I think that's vital. One of the things that Adam Phillips talks about suggests that psychology is really, or therapy and those kind of therapeutic paradigms are to help us forget about ourselves. So almost to get our hands off of ourselves. And I find that to be kind of the nature of what happens in 12-step movements, is that the movement is really away from selfishness and self-centeredness, which is a lot of modern psychology can perpetuate, to this movement to, like you were saying, to the other, to the world, to service to something and with something, which is out of one's own referential state, I guess.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think it's a paradox that we are more medicated than we've ever been from a mental health perspective. We're in therapy more than we've ever been, and yet we're still seeing rates of anxiety, depression, suicide, addiction, all on the increase. So that's a bit of a paradox. We're throwing more resources than we've ever had at this, and yet it doesn't seem to be moving the needle. And I want to be clear, as a psychologist, right? I'm for medication and I'm for therapy, but I think you put your finger on something. There is something about the modern pursuit of mental health that does keep us pretty much ruminating on our own selves, where, again, a lot of research. So it just takes something like mindfulness.
Yes.
So mindfulness is a really powerful technique, but one of the things that mindfulness does for us is it gets us to stop thinking about ourselves. We get out of our own heads and we become grounded and present. Or you think about something like gratitude. That's a huge thing right now with mental health benefits. And so gratitude is just saying thank you for some gift or favor. Yes. But there's this kind of cosmic aspect to gratitude. Like, who do you say thank you to for, like, your life,
Right.
or this sunset, or this next breath, or this moment. So even that posture of gratitude is, in a cosmic sense, expressing thanks to some gift that has been given to you from outside of yourself.
Yes.
And so that's the point I'm trying to make in the book, is if you notice all these threads that point to better mental health, they're always pulling you out of your self-rumination and into a relationship with a reality bigger than yourself. Now, obviously, for Christians, we name that bigger reality as God. Recovery communities will call it, a higher power. But there is something about describing it as a relationship, as a personal relationship with reality. And I know in an increasingly post-Christian culture that easy recognition is harder, but people just say, I'm just grateful, or I say thanks to the universe. But even then, the universe, you're assuming, is in a relational posture towards you.
Yes.
That's not just inert supernovas and black holes.
Right.
So that's the thread to kind of trace there, is like how mental health is related to this relational posture to reality bigger than yourself. And that's a great place. That's a God-adjacent conversation to start talking with a culture that is increasingly struggling with belief.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's interesting to me also that, like, in the last, season of Christianity, the way that theology was framed, and really conversion, which I don't know if we need to walk down that road, but is really a personal thing.
Yeah.
And so this personal relationship with Jesus, right? So the person is centered, and all even of kind of the more modern constructs of faith, where it seems to be that another way of looking at that is this movement outward is into a community of people, into relationships, right? Where I'm a part of, but I'm not centered, right? That's what Roland Williams talks about. Community is the place where God happens. Right.
Yeah.
And so the happening of God is placed in those kind of movements beyond myself.
And it also pulls you out of, and I think this is another thing to explore, is because I think a lot of people are limited by an exclusively therapeutic conversation, because by pulling us out in a relationship with other people, there's also like moral obligations and duties.
Yeah.
So we all know. So psychologists will say that loving relationships are probably the most predictive thing of, physical longevity and emotional health. But anybody who's been in a loving relationship knows that those relationships carry obligations and duties. There are moments when we have to sacrifice, and there can be a real, Christians would describe this like carrying the cross. There is a burden there, a sacrifice, a kenotic emptying that I have to do to actually love.
Yes.
And so a culture that is so obsessed with self-care can struggle with, like, it's not going to feel good to apologize, to make amends. It's not going to feel good to walk alongside an aging parent. That's not a fun thing,
right?
But it's in those relationships with each other that the deep joys of life actually emerge, and that's kind of a bit of a paradox that I think Christianity has always spoken to. That kind of sense that love can be agonizing,
yes,
and yet it is. Those who are willing to lose their lives in that journey find themselves on the far side of that.
Yeah.
But a culture that can't move through that hard thing because it's unpleasant or it makes demands of me is never going to experience those thriving relationships.
Yeah, that's right. I think most of my friends that have walked away from the church have walked away because there's been a dearth of relationship, or the relationships that are there are all predicated on some kind of moral rectitude.
Yeah.
And I think they've walked away not necessarily from God, but from the community of faith into the God of their own understanding in AA or wherever, or kind of spiritual but not religious, And I think part of the reclamation of the church has to be that place where spiritual disciplines are the practice of curiosity, of wonder and awe, like you're talking about, of vulnerability, of really kind of shared brokenness, that we say, hey, we're walking each other home together, right? And I think there's so much of the church that has not done that, And I think that's part of at least my hope for the future, that the call of the kingdom is to walk in that way more.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think we're all hungry for those relationships, but then look towards a church that doesn't embody them.
Yeah.
And feel dismayed or disillusioned. I think anybody who's been part of this journey for a long time have been dismayed at the church's behavior or the shallowness that we were describing earlier, coming to a church where people are not letting those cracks show. They're not stepping into authenticity or taking that risk. Kind of back to that Johnny Cash idea where we see those struggles out loud. Then they realize, I guess everybody here is kind of put together. Everybody here is really successful. Everybody has perfect marriages and perfect families. And so I sit on my secrets. And then eventually you just kind of drift away because you're like, I guess I don't.
Yeah.
But as you know, and as I know, if everybody was honest, like everybody's a wreck.
Just a dumpster fire.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Everybody's a dumpster fire. And so we got to get to those relational capacities where a little bit, so you don't want to kind of completely dump all of that out on a Sunday morning, but we do need to create venues where that authenticity or transparency can slowly take risks.
100%.
And I love Brene Brown when she talks about shame and community, and she says, the biggest thing that combats shame in a community is me too.
Yes.
Like I experienced that too, and so we got to create spaces where people could be brave that way and say, that's me as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You're writing a new book where you're looking at the text of Scripture through the eyes and the lens of love.
Yes. Yeah. It's called The Book of Love.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Is it a pop-up book? What is it?
No, it's a book. No, that would be good though. I should think about that. I don't know if I have the paper skills to make that. But it's called The Book of Love, and the idea is like, how, if you're going to read the Bible as a book of love, how would you do that? And for a lot of people, that would be fairly straightforward. But often we typically tiptoe around passages we don't like. Conservatives do that. Progressives do that. Sure. So what would it be like to not just kind of pick and choose your way through Scripture to get to that loving sermon or message? What would it be like to read the whole thing through, even looking at the hard stuff? And so I'm excited about the book because I think it'll be challenging no matter where you are on the theological spectrum. I think if you're conservative or traditional evangelical, there'll be things in there that'll nudge you.
Yeah.
And if you're a liberal, social justice oriented, progressive Christian, there'll be going to be some things that will nudge you as well. And so I read from Genesis to Revelation through that hermeneutical lens. How can we even read this text as a message about love?
That's great. Now, I totally can get that in the New Testament. I have this Walter Brueggemann ringing in my ear saying that God of the Old Testament is recovering from violence. So how do you do that in some of those texts in the Old Testament?
Well, I think obviously one of the things that you can do is see Jesus as the hermeneutical lens. So the nerdy term would be reading Scripture Christologically, so through Christ. But that can sometimes create tensions because of what theologians and scholars call supersessionism, which is just a fancy term for saying how Christians look back at the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and go, well, the Hebrew Scriptures and the God of the Hebrew Scriptures is just like morally problematic. And given Christianity's history of anti-Semitism and treatment of the Jews, that posture of looking at our gospel, our New Testament is grace-filled and loving, and the Old Testament is backwards and violent and primitive, does create some anxiety for the Christian-Jewish interfaith conversation. Now, as a Christian, I do believe that Christ is the hermeneutical lens for all of Scripture. But what I try to do in Scripture, in the book, is to also show how a lot of the questions that we raise as Christians were raised within the Hebrew Scriptures like themselves. And a simple example of that would be like the book of Jonah. and I tell a story in the book how I was in Europe and I was talking to somebody in the community who was an atheist. And he said, well, what are you here for? And I said, well, I'm speaking at various churches. And he said, well, what are you speaking about? And I said, well, I'm speaking about the book of Jonah. And he kind of got a smile on his face like, oh, how cute. And he said, that's a story about the whale. And you could just see he was like, I'm talking to somebody who believes in unicorns.
Yeah.
Like this fairy tale of a story. Like, who could possibly believe in a guy and a whale for 3 days, Yeah. And I go, yeah, it is a story about the whale, but that's not really what the story's about. And so I talk about how, Jonah ran because he was to preach this message of grace to the Assyrians. And if you don't know who the Assyrians were, they were like the Nazis of the ancient world. Yeah. And they were the people that came in and literally conducted a genocide on the northern tribes of Israel. They're lost to history after the Assyrians come in and deport them. And so here's this little story about a prophet of Israel go to the capital of the Assyrians and say, give them a chance at grace.
You got a second chance.
Yeah, and he refuses.
Yeah.
He runs. Now, it's not clear why he runs. That only comes in the very end of this, in chapter 4. And Jonah says to God, when God does spare them, right, the horror has happened. God has actually shown grace to his enemies. And Jonah's like, I knew this was going to happen. This is why I ran, because you are
all these
gracious
things.
and compassionate. I knew you'd forgive them. He's like, I knew you'd forgive them. And then God ends on this like haunting question, which is like, should I not have compassion? Right? Should I not have concern for even your enemies? And the point I'm trying to raise in that story is like, I get a lot of the, violence of the Old Testament.
The smiting.
Right. The smiting and the enemies.
Yeah.
But here Israel elects to insert into its sacred texts this story where God asks the question. This question kind of hangs over it, which is, should I not care about? Right, I know you want me to smite them, but should I not have compassion? And so that's one of the things I try to do in the book is to say you don't always need to jump to the New Testament. That the Hebrew Scriptures themselves are pushing their moral imagination to entertain a grace so audacious it can strike us as just almost impossible. Is it possible to even believe that God might care about these evil, wicked people? And in our world today, where there's a lot of political polarization, to dare to entertain Jonah's question, should I not care about them too? Well, nobody wants to entertain that question. Yeah. So that's some of the stuff I do in the book is try to not quite just make it Jesus against the Old Testament, but see how the Old Testament itself is asking those questions on its own terms.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's beautiful. What has surprised you about that journey for yourself or for things that you're discovering about the nature and character of God?
Yeah. I think, many things surprised me, different parts of it. One of the hard things I try to do in the book is deal with the problem of evil. I walk along. I'm a college professor, as you mentioned, so I'll walk alongside young people. And in my pastoral counseling with them, that's probably the biggest thing that they struggle. But beyond what you were describing earlier, just the behavioral witness of the church, the biggest thing is why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? And so trying to say something constructive about that has been something I've tried to do for many years, and so that's one thing. Trying to describe that, and we can go into that, but also trying to rehabilitate books that people don't know what to do with. Like, obviously, I have a whole chapter on Revelation, and a lot of people just don't know what to do with that book at all, and so that's kind of fun. Kind of not jumping around books or texts or problems, but go right at them and go like, I think the Bible has some surprises. If we let it speak and we're patient and we don't come up with preconceived notions, I think Scripture still has a lot to surprise us with.
Yeah. How do you? I'm interested in something you said, because I think it's where a lot of people end up coming to church and having these questions but don't know how to ask them.
Yeah.
And I think there can be a lot of kind of group belief where we say a lot of things we actually don't believe, right?
Yeah.
We can say creeds all day long, and but it really just kind of tapers or masks over kind of a functional agnosticism that everybody kind of struggles with.
Yeah.
And so the problem of pain, like how do you understand that from kind of from the both the book you're writing and your own framework?
I think one of the things I try to do is say everybody has a problem of pain. So the atheist, the materialist, they have their own problem of evil, which is, does evil even exist? I use a quote from the atheist Richard Dawkins, who basically says, the world has exactly the properties it's supposed to have. Nothing here is broken at all. If a child dies of cancer, that's not an error. That's not an offense. That's not a wound. And yet something in us, and J.R.R. Tolkien wrote this famous essay called On Fairy Stories.
Yeah.
Trying to justify what things like the Lord of the Rings and fairy stories help us with. And one of the things he describes is the sense of revolt, that we do have this abiding sense that a child dying of cancer is wrong, that the world should be otherwise.
Yes.
And from a material perspective, that's irrational. This idea that it should be or even could be other than exactly what it is. And so I think the Christian story wins on that account, that the fact that we are offended by evil, that we do feel like something is deeply wrong or broken. Like, that's the Christian story.
Yeah.
Evil isn't just the way things are. It's not karma. It is a catastrophe.
Yes.
And it shouldn't be here. And so that I think that's a win for the Christian story, because I think it speaks to our emotions. And the other thing I think the Christian story wins, as opposed to maybe like a pagan story of evil, where we're good and evil are kind of eternal. And if you're a Star Wars fan, right? For every Jedi, there's a Sith, or if there's good magic, there's black magic. There's the trouble with that idea is that evil, therefore, is intrinsic and ineradicable. And so the Christian story, it rejects that too, and it says no, that what you do in the fight against evil matters and contributes to a far-seen horizon of ultimate victory. And so where I think, Christians struggle on origins, like how did it happen? How did evil enter the world?
Yeah.
But as far as coming alongside our feelings of outrage in the face of pain and suffering, and saying that what you do today in your small attempts to beat back the darkness or fight evil matters and contributes to the ultimate victory is very empowering and motivational. And so I think, to me, that's where the Christian story in evil, despite its weaknesses, has a lot of strengths going for it, because it's the most empowering story that we have in face of the darkness and the pain and the suffering of the world.
That's great. I think part of that for me, as you're talking, really strikes a chord that part of our story as well is a story of presence in the pain.
Yes.
Like, we don't walk away from that. I don't think for me, it feels really difficult to try to explain that, particularly in the midst of that, but to say that we, in these unexplainable things, often we're not going anywhere.
Right.
That God, if Peter's right, descends into hell. Right. And so that hell is not a God-forsaken place.
Right.
Then,
yeah.
right. And so I think that's the presence of the community in that space to bear witness that there is a love that will not let us go in the midst of that. Has to be tangible.
And the other thing I'd add here too is like hope. I do think a lot of young people, as we kind of descend increasingly into a post-Christian culture, have adopted the ethics of love and justice from the Judeo-Christian tradition, but they have dropped the eschatological or the metaphysical belief in hope. And so all there is just the revolution. It's just the activism.
Yeah.
But if you spend any time with activist groups, they're struggling with a lot of burnout, a lot of sense of futility, despair. Right? It's not like justice. That call to justice is not sustainable unless there's a metaphysics of hope that suggests that, listen, you might not see the outcome in your lifetime.
That's right.
But again, what you do matters, because it is contributing to, like Martin Luther King said,
the
like
arc of justice.
Arc of justice.
That's right.
So you got to have, and I think that's one of the things that's happened in the contemporary kind of like social justice movement, which I affirm, but in the civil rights season, right, a lot of that articulation of justice was articulated in a context of hope and love, because it was coming out of a Christian worldview.
It's coming out of the black church.
Exactly.
Right.
It's coming out of the black church. And so it had all of these resources to make that effort sustainable and keep it humble and loving.
Yes.
But the word love that's nowhere in any sort of justice discourse right now. But that was like a big word back in the 60s.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to be clear, I'm not trying to critique the social justice thing, because obviously you can't read scripture without having that as an important element of it. But it's the impoverishment of its capacities for things like hope that I think Christianity can help reinvigorate some of these impulses that we're seeing amongst our young people.
That's beautiful. What has shown up at a prison every week done to you?
Well,
taught you.
I have a story I'm going to tell tomorrow about that. But one of the things I'll share, and I share it in the book, the Johnny Cash book, but I'll share tomorrow as well, is that a lot of times when we talk about solidarity, we are the ones kind of riding in on the white horse. We are out there being the hands and the feet of Jesus. And all of that's true. But I went out to the prison because I was in a season of doubt. I was in a season of deconstruction. I don't know if that's a word you guys throw around a lot. I was questioning a lot of things. And in Matthew 25, when parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus says, whenever you welcome the prisoner, you welcome me. So I went out there for like a spiritual search, not so much to minister, but to look for Jesus. And that he's proven faithful to that. So I don't see myself, I am a chaplain and I do minister and give pastoral care, but more often than not, I find myself rescued. I find my skepticism or my doubts interrupted by the fidelity and the faithfulness. Some of the best Christians I know are incarcerated. Yeah. And the one way I describe it is back to the suburbs. I think it was really healthy for me to be in a place where the gospel matters. Like I mean that like as a matter of life and death.
Like not as an idea, but as a...
And you find this also in recovery communities.
Yes.
Places where I cannot survive this day.
Yes.
Unless God there
God shows
alongside
up.
me. Right.
Right.
And sometimes at least in my church, because my church is pretty suburban, and also because it's associated with a university, pretty highly educated, there is this sense where I think affluence and education causes us to kind of step back from faith and have this kind of like, well, maybe I believe it, maybe I don't.
Let's think about this.
And I can get up and go to church, or I can sleep in. And it becomes this thing that's kind of optional, and you're deciding if you're in or if you're out, or do I believe or do I not? And so it lacks this sort of this urgency.
Yes.
that for me, as a kind of a skeptical person who has a pretty good life, and where it seems like the church thing is just, lame sometimes, or I'm not getting a lot out of it, and I can treat it as something that's discardable or dispensable. When I go out into prison, I'm facing the urgency and the vitality of faith just always infuses some energy back into me. So that's what I have found out there. That being in a place where the gospel is a matter of life and death chastens and humbles my middle class academic.
Yeah.
Crossing my arms and being skeptical. That I've become more impatient with that move in my own life.
Yeah, that's great. That's beautiful. I read a book a while ago by Bob Ekblatt.
Oh yeah, I know Bob.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's great. He came and spoke at something I was doing a couple years ago. But I love the way that he talks, and he's kind of set up ways of reading the Bible among folks that you should never meet. And he said the worst way of reading the Bible is number one, alone, and then number two, with everybody is from your own social class. So when Paul says, "I, Paul, a prisoner," and you can't look around the circle and say, "Hey, John, you were in prison, weren't you?
Yeah.
Tell me about that." Right? That's not a metaphor. It's a lived experience,
Oh, yeah.
And how often then everybody reads the Bible from their own social standings, and sure, then it's just left to right and up. Every day with Jesus is,
Yeah, reading the Bible on the margins. He has a title of a book called "Reading the Bible with the Damned."
I thought, yes.
Yeah, reading the Bible with the damned. And he does Bible studies with like illegal immigrants. He does Bibles inside prisons. He's doing Bible studies in all these kind of marginalized locations, and it comes to life. Like Scripture comes to life read in those locations where sometimes some of that violence or some of the shock of the Scriptures strikes some of us as like a little too much, but. Like if I read through like Revelation in my church, they would be scandalized. But you read it out in prison, they're like, hell yeah, that's the world. I mean, it's amazing. It's remarkable. So I've also benefited from that. Scripture has also come alive out of the prison. I get interrupted all the time by that. Like here's an example of this. Like in progressive spaces who deconstruct a lot, like one of the big things they struggle with is penal substitutionary atonement. Like why does God have to kill somebody to forgive me? Where's the the wrath of God being satisfied and
slaughterhouse?
Yeah, exactly.
God.
And so there's been a lot of, and I was before I went out to prison, I was like, I'm with you on that. I have a lot of those same kind of questions. Like we don't need to lean into shame or guilt or anything like that. And then you go out to a prison and you realize guilt is the pressing pastoral question of their lives. Like, can I be forgiven for what I've done? And so you quickly go out to prison and go like, oh, yes, you are forgiven for your crimes are forgiven. You don't have to carry that guilt anymore. And so suddenly you realize, like a message that, do you need to make teenagers feel guilty and like they're going to hell, during the weekend retreat? Like probably not. Like that might not be a good pastoral move. But there are some of us that feel like we've done things that we cannot be forgiven for.
Yes.
And there's good news for that too, which is that guilt has been taken away. So that's helped me too to realize that a lot of our theology, what we found problematic or whatever, is a large part of our social location.
Yes.
And if we get out of different social locations, we're like, oh, I see why that's there. Like It's not maybe my pressing issue, but I see why that might be good news to somebody else.
That's right. Yeah. And I love that too, that there's a lot of different ways of looking through the lens of Scripture, right? All of them can be fantastic. Well, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of them can be fantastic. But I think to find one totalizing hermeneutic, maybe beyond the life of Jesus, becomes there's limits to that.
Yeah, I agree.
And so that I find penal substitution helpful. If that's the only lens I look through it, it's terrible at the end of the day.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It cuts both ways, right? And so some of that is like, absolutely, this is what God does, but God is also there may be a larger landscape that God's working in as well to bring those things to fruition.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
What are you reading and listening to right now that's like giving you a sense of wonder and awe, or you just loving?
What am I reading right now?
Yeah.
I've been rereading some Flannery O'Connor. I'm a huge Flannery O'Connor.
Okay.
My wife hates Flannery O'Connor.
Why?
But I love it.
Back?
It's so violent.
Oh, yeah.
It's so violent. So So I routinely go through seasons where I kind of revisit Flannery O'Connor.
Okay. What do you like about her? Like for folks that have never read her, Southern writer. I mean, just
boy, she's hard to describe. Flannery O'Connor writes about the South. She's a Catholic writer writing about the Protestant South. But the characters in her short stories and her novels, two collections of short stories, are like freaks, weirdos, backwoods preachers, you know. But one of the biggest things that jolts you in her work is that there's typically, not always, but there's often typically like a moment of like violence.
Yes.
But the moment of violence is often associated with like grace. And so like one of her most famous stories is a good man is hard to find. And I probably, spoiler alert here or like that, but there's a murder. But at the moment of the murder, there's this moment of like divine revelation. And it's the murder part that my wife hates. She's like, these are just gruesome stories. So she's an acquired taste. But people asked O'Connor about like why are your stories so violent and weird and strange? Like I thought you were a Christian author. And she has this phrase where she goes, well, you know, when an author can assume that their audience are on the same page, then you don't have to use such dramatic things. But she goes, but to the deaf, one has to shout, and to the blind, one has to draw large and startling figures. And so as she saw the culture pivoting away from Christianity, she was drawing these large and startling figures to kind of wake people up in the middle of the story about some transcendent reality out there. But anyway, so I think she's the greatest Christian artist, one of the greatest Christian artists of all time.
I think she has a lot to say to the church.
Oh, yeah.
Right now, too, because I think it's the way that she it's like full circle coming back to Johnny Cash, the way that she is able to hold like the absolute like repugnant things that we do as humans, and that it's shot through with the grace of God. Like, how does she do that? But that's like, that lives in me. That lives in everyone, right? And I think she holds that really well.
She does.
That's great. What music are you listening to? And
what music? So I went through. So I'm also kind of a weird history buff, and so I watched. Is it Ken Burns? Is it Ken Burns, the documentary?
Yeah.
And I just watched his documentary over the summer about the Vietnam War.
Okay.
And was just really struck by the soundtrack of all of that.
Oh, wow.
So I just have built this Vietnam era soundtrack, which is interesting because in the early years, it's this Johnny Cash, it's early rock, but then it gets, as the 60s push on, it pivots to some more psychedelic kinds of stuff.
Right. Hendrix.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the merging of rock and so from like 55 to 65, I've made this kind of playlist of all sorts of music during that time. Some of Motown was breaking out as well. So it's an interesting mix from Aretha Franklin to Cream to early Beatles to, you know, it's...
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it's a self-selected, and it's interesting how quickly the music changed during that time.
Yeah.
If you just think about from the Beatles when they first showed up in their suits,
right,
and they're shaking their kind of mop hair, to where you get to like Sgt. Pepper, and that was a really quick pivot during that time. So it's just interesting culturally to think about how the sound of music was changing during that 55 to 65.
Yeah. I wonder if you can share that on your. We put that on our show notes.
Yeah. It's an interesting listen to. Especially if you get outside your genre, right? If you grab, because folk is going on there too. So you're in the folk revival. So you got folk in there, rock and roll, pivoting to psychedelic rock, and hard rock is starting to show up toward the end of that thing. And you're also getting some great music out of Motown, like Aretha Franklin's doing her thing and all that kind of stuff. Marvin Gaye, it's amazing. If you want to check out any of the books I mentioned, just go to Amazon. They'll be there. But I write Monday through Friday about the intersections of faith and psychology on Substack, experimental theology with Richard Beck. You can subscribe for free. I don't charge. for that. So
How many folks are now signed up for that?
I don't know, a couple thousand.
That's
you know,
great.
so
That's wonderful.
We'll see. Yeah.
Good, good. Well, thank you for being here.
yeah, thank you. No,
Yeah.
it's been great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The way we kind of get out of this is that you'll say your name, then I'll say my name, and we'll sign off. So,
Richard Beck.
and I'm Matt Russell, and this is Pod Have Mercy.